For many people shopping in this price range, the Sourcepoint 888 is probably the speaker to get, or at least it should be on the short list. It may not be the speaker you think you want, but hear me out and then decide. The MoFi Electronics Sourcepoint 888 is a floor-standing speaker with two 8-inch woofers and an 8-inch mid-range, and the 8-inch mid-range has a coaxial 1.25-inch soft dome tweeter at the center. Designed by famed engineer Andrew Jones, the 888 is a robust 42 inches tall, 12.6 inches wide, and 16 inches deep. It weighs 96 pounds. The cabinet features 2 ports and is available in black or walnut finish. Sensitivity is 87 dB at 1 meter with 1 watt input. Price is $4,999 per pair. All right, with that brief product preamble aside, let's get down to some highlights of the overall sound quality. To explain the character of the 888, I need to tell a short story. When I turned 16, I was the kid at the DMV at 9 a.m. on my birthday to take my road test. Cars were a thing in the 1970s. That summer, not being able to afford a car, I got the idea in my head that a motorcycle might do the job. So I went with a friend to the local motorcycle dealer. There was just one. They carried 2 brands, Honda and Yamaha. Both had inexpensive bikes, probably 125 cc's. So I asked the salesman what the difference was. He said, pointing to the Yamaha, "Oh, you don't want that. If you crack the throttle, you'll pop a wheelie." I, of course, immediately wanted the Yamaha. Now let's talk about the Sourcepoint 888. An essential characteristic of the 888 is something that can be called forgivingness. You may have heard speakers or other audio gear that is kind of the opposite of forgiving. Every little detail is revealed, and on bad recordings or in a less than ideally treated room, this can be painful. But some, not all gear that is revealing, also sounds amazingly good on good recordings. The 888 manages to let the music through while slightly smoothing out the rough edges. Now, it's important to note that the 888 does this without being rolled off. In fact, in the top 2 octaves, it's slightly bright. This means the 888 doesn't really sound dull, and it also means the details aren't destroyed. There seem to be 2 parts to the 888 forgivingness recipe that I can suggest. First, it sounds like the initial part of transients is slightly overdamped. You may have heard horn speakers that do the opposite. With them, you get the impression that on rim shots or trumpet blasts, there's overshoot, and the sound is a little slightly spiky or piercing. The 888 is slightly softened, but not dull. This seems important for prospective buyers because this character of the 888 fits nicely in my listening with the flaws of many recordings made from, say, 1980 to 2000, and even some made beyond that point. The flaws of digital, which I cover in our Solving the Problems of Digital series, are somewhat ameliorated here. You know they're there, but the 888 is revealing and the pain is reduced. The other element of the 888 character that works nicely for fans of older recordings, I'm going to say before the year 2000, very approximately, is the bass balance. The mid-bass and low bass of the 888 are somewhat elevated, in my measurements about plus 5 dB. But recording standards have changed over the years, so most older recordings are slightly rolled off in the bass. This gets larger in magnitude the older the recording. For the sake of argument, if we said 1980s recordings are minus 3 dB in the mid-bass and 1960s recordings are down minus 6 dB in the mid-bass, you can see how the 888 bass balance, which I characterize as being very round numbers, about plus 5 dB, might help. These numbers aren't exact, of course, they're illustrative. You have to add to this that people prefer slightly elevated mid-bass even on modern recordings. That's not my guess. It is what people tell me. It is what people say in the comments, but even more, there's research showing that people like a small mid-bass rise. Perhaps you can see that even with smaller recording roll-offs in the bass, the 888 bass tuning might help. But wait, there's more. To generate flat bass output, it really helps to have very stiff walls. Think of a concrete floor, 6-inch studs, bracing, 4 mixed layers of plywood and drywall on the surfaces, and you kind of get the idea. My point is, you probably don't have such a room, and thus your room is somewhat leaky in the bass. Again, you're likely to want some help from your speakers, and in my testing, the 888 seemed aimed at just this. Let's quickly cover some examples of difficult recordings where I found the 888 to work rather nicely. First up, the Black Keys Delta Cream. This is a recent recording, but man, can it sound edgy thanks to the somewhat hot mastering. On the 888, the bluesy guitars are wailing away, but they're balanced in the mix, and the bass drive is solid. Then there's Radiohead's OK Computer. This can sound slightly strangled, but the 888 opens it up a bit and helps the rhythm section really work. Next, I tried Los Lobos, Just Another Band from East LA. This one can sound thin, sometimes it just fails to rock, but not on the 888. Heart's Dog and Butterfly from the 1970s can pierce and lack the rhythmic drive you really expect from a hard rock band like this. But the 888 makes it work just like you remember it, maybe with rose-colored glasses. Other older or difficult recordings that were handled well included Bernstein's Copeland Collection and Miles Davis's In a Silent Way. Now, I don't want to leave the impression that the 888 completely solves the difficulties of these recordings, but the 888 helps, and they help enough that some music seems to cross a threshold of listenability. This, I think, is a major accomplishment if this kind of music is what you like to listen to. On better recordings, the 888 is fine, but if you're familiar with other speakers I've covered in this series, you can get more resolution and a more vivid portrayal of the music. On the best recordings, there are other speakers that are more exciting by being more transparent and better defined. But, as with Honda versus Yamaha, you may not want more exciting, and I think you will want to consider the price not just in dollars, but in suitability to recording styles. Sadly, life involves trade-offs. All right, now let's turn our attention to voicing and the details of voicing. First up, let's look at mid-bass. The 888 is elevated in the mid-bass, at least in an acoustically managed room. People generally prefer some extra energy in this range, as I mentioned. I do think the 888 goes a touch beyond that request for more, but in your room, you may not get this result. If you do get that result, you'll find the 888 bass is warm, but not super tight. Let's look at low bass. The 888 measures as having good output into the low 30 Hz range. In listening to a series of low bass test tracks, I would say the 888 is better than most here because roll-off often starts in the mid-40s, not in the low 30s on other speakers. But the 888 is not as powerful sounding as the best speakers in this price range are from, say, 30 to 40 Hz. Remember, low E on a bass guitar is 41 Hz, so you really need to be into music that has energy in this frequency range to even care. Overall frequency balance is the next voicing factor I like to look at. The general shape of the frequency curve on the 888s is downward sloping. So, from 200 Hz to about 4 kHz, output falls about 5 dB, which is about the 1 dB per octave slope prescribed by research. This is gentle enough that you don't explicitly hear it as roll-off. Note that because of the bass rise, this downward tilt actually applies from about 40 Hz to 4 kHz. Octave-to-octave bumpiness, another factor, is slightly higher than with speakers at 2x or 4x the price. Looking at treble is slightly elevated, starting at the top of the mid-range of around 4 kHz. But this, again, seems to happen gently. There's more treble in the top octave, where it's mainly affecting overtones, than in the octave just below that. Because of the factors mentioned above, the 888 doesn't generally sound harsher than normal, but there is some added glow to high frequencies. Then we look at the power band. From 200 to 500 Hz, the 888 has good output, although this is slightly masked by the extra output below 200 Hz. Octave-to-octave variations mean that some instruments are less tightly defined in this region than might be ideal. And finally, let's look at sound staging. The 888 can produce a good center image, though I would say it's not its central strength when compared to speakers in the next price range up. Sometimes performers get slightly locked onto the speaker cabinets with the 888, and some recordings have a bit less depth than can be achieved. But there are recordings that image beautifully on the 888, and if you listen to older recordings, you often have to accept odd mixing choices, so this variation or strangeness in imaging may not be distracting. All right, let me summarize. The Sourcepoint 888 mixes together two unusual and useful qualities: a highly desirable tone curve and real-world transient handling. This works well for older or difficult recordings and for less than ideal listening rooms. This combination is what I think many listeners would want for everyday use. If my description sounds more like a high-end SUV than a supercar, that's about right, and you don't drive a supercar every day. I hope you've enjoyed this review of the MoFi Sourcepoint 888 speakers. Thanks for watching, and we hope to see you again soon.